The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
I know what that means now.
Yeah, no, you really don't. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast, in which I, your host, Tylor, gives exactly the same introduction every other week when it's my turn to do introductions. And I am joined, as always, by Greg, who probably thinks I'm lazy for not coming up with some sort of weird idea every other week. But that's his job, not mine. Greg, what weird thing would you have done if this was your week to do an introduction?
I'm still looking to hear your NPR voice. There was a time in my life where I was very good at impersonating Ira Glass because I listened to so much This American Life. I think I've lost that skill, but I want to hone that impression again. And then that's when I will be really back on top of my Through the Glass Columns introductions. Tylor, we have a little bit of exciting business before we get to our two chapters. Our two chapters tonight, of course, are chapter 43, Care for the Living, and 44, The Breaking Storm. But before we do that, last episode we mentioned that it had been your birthday, but we had not yet celebrated your birthday in person. And when we did, I revealed to you that for your birthday, I got the podcast some merch. So this is our official announcement that we now have Through the Glass Columns available on TeePublic, which generically means you can get a Through the Glass Columns t-shirt. But the way that store works is they'll throw that design on whatever you want. So if you want a tapestry, if you want a pillowcase, if you want a notebook, if you want fill in the blank, you can get our logo on said items. So this was done in collaboration with our friend Ben, who has been a guest on the show. And Ben runs a TeePublic store named after his favorite Star Wars character. So it's called Gonk Squadron. That's Gonk Squadron. And if you look in our show notes, you should find a link over to that store, which will take you to the place that you, faithful listener, can buy a shirt. And to be honest, as far as we're currently aware, there's only one in the world, and Tylor wore it yesterday, not today. So you could be the second, the third, the fourth to own said shirt. You could even beat me to it because I didn't order myself one. I just ordered Tylor one. And what we want to say, Ben is a good friend, a talented artist, and put up with my really terrible Photoshop skills in designing our logo. But the way he runs his TeePublic shop is whatever profit he gets from it, he donates to a charity that benefits foster kids in the foster care system here in Massachusetts. So if you are on the fence, do it for the foster kids. We will not see a dime of this money. Ben will not see a dime of this money. It will all go right to a charity, which we're pleased with. So again, if Tylor's done his job, you can scroll down and click in the show notes to go to that merch page. And if I have done my job, you should be able to go to social media and find a link. But we hope this is something people are after. I own a great many podcast shirts myself. And are you, a middle-aged white dude if you don't own a full array of your favorite podcast shirts? And if you're not a middle-aged white dude, join us in our celebration of electronic media, and we will all look very styling. Tylor, say what a great fit it is and how comfy you are.
I actually was pretty impressed by the quality of the shirt, I have to say. I don't know if you clicked like the premium option or what have you, but it was pretty wonderful for the 85 and humid day that we had a few days ago. If you live in the South, they're solid shirts for you. Also, you're right. You'll look exactly like a mid-30s white dude, and that's what I am. So it was perfect. I Loved that gift. Thank you. It was wonderful. But I have nothing else to say about it. Normally, that's because I can't spoil anything, but I'm not going to spoil the shirt for you. I just like the shirt, and that's my entire review of it. Let's then turn our attention to the actual, things we read this week, although it looked like you maybe had one last thought.
I was just gonna say, tell the people how, as you walk down the street wearing it, men, women, dogs, they all threw themselves at you and at your feet and just bowed down to your glorious fashion sense. So just confirm that and then summarize chapter 43.
The only humans I interacted with were in my Dungeons and Dragons group, but yeah, I did get a compliment on it. Chapter 43, Care for the Living. Varen leads Perrin to the inn, and he notices that all of the boys who have been following him are clearly proud of their battles against the Trollocs, and their families are kind of tense and worried but happy. But then Perrin begins to hear the families of those who were lost. He is kind of worried about this and immediately flees to the inside of the inn. It's clear that he wants to be around these people as little as possible while they are mourning. He once he gets inside, he tries to claim that he was lightheaded and that was the only thing going on, but Fail immediately sees through it and tries to reassure him. And she once again says this phrase that is the name of the chapter, that you need to care for the living or weep for the dead, but you can't do both. At this point, he notices that there is a barrel of old swords in the common room, and he is shocked that there were that many swords in the entirety of the two rivers, much less that they have all been gathered into one place. At this point, Perrin starts to try to give some orders or direct what is going to go on, but Yvonne, one of the warders, tells him that all will be well, and then Perrin starts to worry about whether Varen is actually kind of caring for the Two Rivers folk at all. He starts to be concerned that the Aes Sedai are kind of manipulating the situation, either to prop him up as a false leader or to create something else that would be beneficial for the White Tower, and he's really doubtful of the motives of both of the Aes Sedai. At this point, Perrin asks after Loyal, who he's told is helping to fell trees for the stakes, and he also asks after Lord Luke, who it turns out is not in town and is out hunting, and he gets a detail of when Lord Luke was last in town, and it does help to dissuade him from the possibility that Luke was the most likely cause of the Trollocs ambushing his group, but he does decide that it must have been someone tipping them off, and Luke is still his kind of number one suspect, even though there is something that could potentially get him out of being the person most responsible. Varen, during this conversation, observes that Luke has been causing trouble even while he's helping, including the fact that recently he told the White Cloaks that Emond's Field is closed to them, and that created quite an uproar among the White Cloaks. We then have Perrin recognize one of the boys in the room as Uin Fingar, who is only a couple of years younger than him, but has changed dramatically since the last time he saw him. At this point, a number of the boys who were not with Perrin originally start asking about his adventures, saying that they wish they could have gone along with Rand and Matt, and they ask kind of increasingly outlandish questions. But it's worth noting that Perrin gives most of the details and describes things, but one, the boys do not really like it when he gives an accurate description of how terrible adventuring is, and two, Perrin is very careful to avoid giving any details about the stone or anything that would implicate Rand as potentially being able to channel or being the Dragon Reborn. The boys ask about Rand and Matt specifically, and this is when Perrin notes that both Cam and Matt's dad, Abel, that's his name, are in the room, and he tells them about Rand and Elaine, but he actually kind of waters it down. He doesn't say that Elaine is the daughter heir of Andor, but instead that she is just a noble, and everyone seems to doubt that until they realize that Fail is a noble, and she is clearly interested in Perrin, so it doesn't seem quite so outlandish anymore. At this point, I guess that happened in the. Oh, at this point, Loyal arrives. Loyal is asked how the Waygate could have possibly been reopened, and he explains that if someone had gone there on the outside, they could have potentially started letting people in again. And then he describes the fact that Waygates can, in fact, be destroyed. He says there are two ways of doing this. One of them involves 13 Aes Sedai and a Sa'angreal, so that is clearly not an option. The other is to remove both of the Avendasora leaves from the Waygate, and once that happens, the Waygate will sort of not be openable and will slowly fade until it dies. dies. Loyal was hesitant to do this originally, but says now he would be willing to do so in order to protect the two rivers. But Perrin tells him no, that he should not do so, and that they will deal with it after he has been healed. At this point, Alana arrives. He again tells Loyal before anything else happens, it is his responsibility to deal with the Waygate. And then he starts talking like it was years earlier. It becomes apparent that he has a fever that has gotten extremely high and he is barely surviving. Alana says that the arrow has dug itself into his bone, and so she's going to have to probably kill him. But if it doesn't kill him, she can heal him. And then he is given a stick to bite on because the pain is going to be so bad. And then the pain is so bad, he breaks the stick. I don't have a whole lot more that I can do to describe Aes Sedai healing, but it doesn't sound fun. What did you think of this chapter, which I'll be totally honest, is the first chapter in this entire book that I kind of thought maybe we could have done without this one. Is that your impression as well?
Oh, wow. I mean, maybe that is why I think that's the first summary ever where you just totally broke in the middle and cried a
Accurate.
little before continuing on. So I think this is a chapter that felt like a moment to catch our breath, right? Like we've
Uh-huh.
had a lot of action. We've been in this plot line for a
A
very
long
long
time.
time in terms of recent books in general, but I don't know if that would bear out as like the highest page count or some such, but it has been a lot of chapters in a row
I
sticking
think
here, which
I
makes
would
it feel more like book one.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would hazard to guess this is probably the longest single POV we've had since book one. Maybe there was a Rand stretch at the beginning of book two, but for at least two books, this is definitely the longest time we've been in one character's head.
Um, and so, I have a lot of things in my notes, most, I'm sure, not that important, but I will say the thing I wrote is, you had brought up last episode, I believe maybe two ago, that Perrin was kind of hesitant to take on the crown, right? Not a
Yeah.
literal crown, but hesitant to take on the leadership role. And I felt like the kind of main thrust of this chapter was how kingly he's becoming, right? That
Yeah.
he is this kind of folk hero figure and he's thinking carefully, not just about his own culpability in what has happened, but he's, as you pointed out, the theme of the chapter, he's weighed down by guilt over
Mhm.
who has been lost and is trying to learn how to take care of those who are still alive and how to make changes in that. And that all felt to me like a clear, next, you know, item on the skill tree of becoming a leader for this character.
Yeah, and I really liked that, particularly in the context of Varen talking about Luke, because I think we get a really great contrast of Perrin the leader versus Luke the leader in this chapter. And I think it both kind of reinforces what Perrin is worried about and makes me as a reader not worry about Perrin as a leader at all, right? Because we learn Perrin is very concerned about those who are lost. He is kind of risk averse. He doesn't want to do things that would potentially cause things to get worse. And we also learn that he's kind of a very reluctant person to lead. On the other hand, Luke is constantly stirring things up, and he is just outright telling people, it seems, that he has the ability to become a king of some kingdom if he wanted to. It's referred to as him having kind of the rights of a king somewhere. The boys who have heard this tell Perrin that it is Andor, which is clearly not true. They have queens. But I think that contrast between Perrin's reluctant leadership and Luke kind of thrusting himself awkwardly into a position of leadership really does a good job of highlighting all of the positives for Perrin, while probably also making Perrin a little bit nervous that there's someone else who feels better for the position of leadership in town.
Yes. So sidebar that whenever you say Luke, I want to go give you an Amparu, Luke, Luke. And I avoid doing so and interrupting your train of thought every week. So let the record show that mentally that's where I go. And then I skip
Most
the next three
weeks.
sentences most weeks. um, I do think that that is a correct read on kind of the purpose of this structure. And what comes to mind is that I'm not going to think of an example off the top of my head, but there are so many plot lines where it kind of boils down to like if you're asking that question, then you are worth being a leader, right?
Yeah.
If you're worried about being a bad leader, if you're worried about being corrupt, then you're not going to be corrupt. If you're worried about being too violent, then you won't be too violent. It's like just asking well, it's often deployed with sanity as well, right? If
Yep.
you're asking the question, am I going insane, then you're not actually going insane, because the character doing so would not ask the question. And I don't mean that insensitively to people who actually deal with their mental health, but within literature and fiction. So I do think that is drawn very
Yeah.
well. And I think the larger structure of these two chapters kind of shows that as well. It's like who's there and who's actually doing the good works versus who's
Yeah.
scheming and manipulating.
I think it was almost exactly 3 books ago that Elias told Perrin, you don't need to worry about wielding the axe until you start liking wielding the axe. That's when you should get rid of it. And I think that that story that Elias was telling him about violence is just as true about leadership, right? You should only do it until you start liking it, and that's the time to step down. No, I think that's a really good call. The only other like small detail I had maybe in the first like third to a half of this chapter is there's something really fun about the idea that Loyal hates cutting down trees, but is by far the best woodsman of anyone in the Two Rivers. That's just a neat little detail. I don't really have much else to say about it. Was there anything else that really stood out to you early on in this chapter? I really felt, if anything, it kind of came alive when Perrin started talking to the boys instead of avoiding talking to the parents.
Yeah, I mean, it's at the end of this chapter that I wrote, he's seeming very kingly, but in the opening section, I wrote down how it's so clear that he's become a folk hero while he's gone, right? Like,
Yeah.
so I think that's the whole point of that opening section is he has the reputation and it comes with the burden of like, where's my son? Where's my boy? Right.
Yeah.
And he's got to deal with that if he's going to assume this title. Just again to hammer home your point that there's guilt weighing heavily on him, and he
Yeah.
has to deal with that as well. So excited that Loyal is here and
Yeah.
seemingly is getting a little more action because I think we've noted the last 2 books he just kind of sits out the climax of the book.
Yeah, no, that is absolutely accurate. Any detail that I can get about Loyal, I am happy for because we are 4 books in and I still don't know much about him other than he doesn't love his mother, which is a character trait that some of us can relate to. Uh, my mom's great. She's a wonderful person. She might listen to this podcast. What?
Why are you crying?
uh, I really thought the most interesting part of this chapter for me was the moment when Perrin is sharing the tales of all of his adventures as a cautionary tale, and all of the boys in the room are taking it as like a grand tale of adventure that they wish they could get in on. And it actually reminded me of something you said on the podcast maybe like a month or two ago. It was this idea that if you want to show how much a character has changed, you want to put them in the same situation again. This is not quite that, but it's putting a character next to someone who would. This is who Perrin would have been if he had not gone away a
Right.
year and a half ago. And I think that kind of accomplishes the same goal.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with you and say the thing back to you in a different way, which is I've been reading a history book about the lead up to Fort Sumter and the start of the Civil War, and it really resonated with Gone with the Wind in my mind,
Yeah.
because I haven't read that much or seen that much about this time period. And there's that moment in Gone with the Wind where they're all like, "Oh, and I got my fancy new uniform, and I'm going to war," and it's all like high times, can't wait to see it.
Yeah.
And this book made clear that's what Charleston was like in the lead up. It's like everybody's like super pumped, like I'm gonna go to war, I'm gonna be the best soldier. Those are these boys, whereas Perrin's the person
Yeah.
halfway through Gone with the Wind who's like, oh, guess what? War sucks. Like it is
Yeah.
not, chivalry and honor and good times. There was a Southern gentleman who predicted at the onset of the war that the blood spilled would barely fill a lady's thimble, and that's really what they thought war was
Yeah.
going to be like. And it's like I think that's these boys. They're feeling like, oh, I'm going to get to do heroic things. This sounds so exciting. Not actually thinking about things like what do you do when you're kind of sort of responsible for deaths.
And then honestly, Robert Jordan does a decent job of highlighting our current political dismay in that all of the boys hear Perrin's harrowing account of war and decide, nah, I still want to go to war. It turns out facts don't
Yeah.
turn you away from your fantasies. And that's sad, but good on Robert Jordan for getting it right. Um, I
It
guess
was weird the boy said fake news. I just that was so prescient. But yes.
uh, to some degree, what we've got then is Perrin worrying about the Aes Sedai, and I don't know where you are at on that, right? I think we've gotten our hints that Varen is mysterious and Alana, we have serious doubts about her kind of alignment, whether she's good or evil. But I think at least the last time we checked in on these characters, both of us were kind of like, yeah, Perrin's worried it might be valid, but I don't really care about these characters enough yet. I need to know more about them. Is that still kind of where you're at with Alana and Varen, at least as far as it relates to the two rivers?
Yeah, I think I always worry when somebody might be binging these episodes in the future and we're like, this is definitely what we said last week. And if they heard it 20 minutes ago, they would just be like, that's definitely not what they said last week. Um, but as I recall, I think I was in a place where it felt like they were hinting so hard
Mm,
that the Aes Sedai were up to no good that it felt to me like they have to be fine.
yeah.
I go back to this kind of old definition from back from book one, which, hey, you referenced book one a minute ago. I was going through some photos with my son for a school project today, and we just hit our second anniversary of
Oh, yeah.
recording this show. I don't think releasing it yet, but by this time 2 years ago, we were recording. Um, so now I lost my train of thought. So I am back to the place that Aes Sedai I mean, they tell literal truths, but sometimes shade things so that they get to pursue their own agenda while not being openly evil. And I think that's my hypothesis for what's going on here. I think there's
Okay.
something larger and different going on, but I'm less confident that that's a negative thing for our characters. I think it's part
Yeah,
of the good fight. We're just not aware of it yet. Um,
absolutely.
okay, and clip it there to make fun of me in 2 months when they're all the big bads of book five.
Oh, 2 months, you sweet summer child. Uh, I think the only last note that I have in this chapter is this is maybe the most unreliable any of our narrators have been so far, right? Perrin is apparently minutes from death and yet barely mentions his pain or disorientation or feverishness or any of the symptoms that it seems like Fail and others were able to notice. I don't have a lot of analysis on that. I think it just kind of reset my expectations a little bit for what our characters could be going through without us hearing about it. And for whatever reason, the only moment that really feels super relevant to me is Moraine chapters, because I am now even less sure what Moraine thinks and does and is, because apparently they can just not tell us they're dying in these POVs. And everyone else I kind of trust to tell the truth to me. But if Perrin can lie to me, Moraine can definitely lie to me.
Uh, yeah, I think we've noted before times when Robert Jordan seems to bump up against the limitations of a first person
Mm-hmm.
narrator. And I think there's a clear case that you could have this chapter rewritten as a very much a fevery dream of
Yeah.
like what's true, what's not, and so on. And I think I would personally find that too disorienting. So I'm glad he makes this choice, although I think you're right when there's such a clear gap between what we're being told and what is the truth that kind of throws the whole experiment up into question, right?
Yeah.
Like, and I think we get those moments in real life too, where you're like, well, I have to believe this or else none of this matters, right?
Totally.
In Dungeons and Dragons, when you're like, we could pretend that was a success roll, and then it's like, no, I mean, this is what my DM says to me. If we falsify one outcome, then we are throwing the whole experiment out the window. So
That
it's pointless without some cost.
that does sound like me, mostly because I like to do horrible things to my players in Dungeons and Dragons. Did you have any last thoughts about this chapter? I think you were right earlier. This isn't a chapter we needed to skip. This was a chapter that kind of retrod a bunch of things we had seen before in new ways. Any last thoughts here before I do a much longer summary of the second chapter?
I will just I don't this is not worth saying, but I'm gonna say it anyway. The only other thing in my notes is it says locked into Fail. I don't know exactly what that means. I guess I'm saying that Perrin was clearly locked into Fail. Whatever conflict they've been going through is
Mm,
probably behind them. That's probably, but Fail was present in your summary and hasn't been remarked upon.
that's
So
yeah.
I think trying to interpret Greg from 3 days ago. I think what I'm saying is like these two are now like in lockstep together as a unit where there was gaps between them. There were gaps between them before.
You've clearly been playing some video games where romances you can kind of flirt with multiple people until the one conversation where you lock them in. Speaking of, who are you romancing in Baldur's Gate? Because I actually don't know this yet.
No comment. It's private.
Woof.
I've been behind on movies. I've been going to the movies. I'll work on it. I'll work on it.
You got to play that game, man. It's so good. If you're listening and haven't played Baldur's Gate 3, go play it. It's incredible. I'm way late on this, but oh my God, it's so good. Chapter 44, The Breaking Storm. Perrin wakes in the inn in a bed. It is morning, but Fail insists that he must rest for several more days before he can leave. He notes that she seems tense and asks why and what is wrong. She tries to kind of weasel out of saying anything and, basically dismiss it and let him rest. But eventually she reveals that Gaul and Loyal are missing and they were seen leaving town talking about kind of a trip through the forest and trees. And Perrin immediately surmises that they are intending to go to the Waygate and close it, despite the fact that he obviously told Loyal that Perrin would take care of it. At this point, Perrin gets up, insisting that he's going to track them down, even though Fail insists that he is in no shape to do so. He eventually makes his way to the stairs, but then collapses, falling down and dragging Fail with him. Eventually, she threatens him that he will basically be killed by her or be killed by going for a ride, so he better get back in bed. At this point, Mistress Elvire arrives and insists that she knows how to handle Two Rivers men better than Fail does. It turns out the way that you do this is by agreeing to everything except for the thing that they don't want to do, and then you just ask them questions until they change their mind about it. I want to criticize the strategy, but it would probably work on me. Perrin is about to be corralled back into bed when there are calls that there is a Trolloc in the village, and immediately Fail pulls a 180 and asks for Stepper to be saddled so that Perrin and she can go and survey the battle. Mistress Elvire immediately kind of dismisses this idea, but eventually they have a standoff, and it seems like Mistress Elvire kind of gives in to Fail's authority on this matter. Eventually, Fail allows Perrin to leave, but says that he must stay away from Trollocs, and he agrees, and she says that if he breaks that promise, she will spank him, which we had to bring that back up again somehow. The horses are saddled, and they mount, but there doesn't seem to be an imminent attack. There's just a large number of people who are kind of milling around in the midst of the city. Bane and Chiad arrive and report that 500 Trollocs are about a mile or two behind them, and then the Aiel and Aes Sedai both have kind of trouble controlling the Two Rivers folks, getting them organized, trying to get them to respond effectively to this. And Perrin then immediately starts giving a couple of orders, talking with Tam, and things start to move much more quickly. People start to get organized, the women go to safe places, the warriors start to assemble, and very quickly it becomes apparent that everyone in town has kind of militarized. Even Sen Bui, who had previously been kind of the Sackville Baggins of the Two Rivers, is giving Perrin salutes and following his orders. And Perrin then begins wondering aloud about the Aes Sedai and what they want. And Fail hears this and says that they want him to be a leader that he was born to be. But Perrin dismisses this. Once the town starts to get organized, Tam kind of takes the lead, at least with running the archers, and all of the boys who were in Perrin's company before surround him seemingly as an honor guard, despite the fact that many of them are injured, and one of them carries a wolf's head banner, which Perrin says that he would not approve of and doesn't think should happen, but the boys all laugh that off and think that it's a very good idea. Perrin clearly wants to send Fail away, but thinks that she will never go along with it, and so he just needs to protect her, but he can tell that her plan is to protect him. Then they wait a long time. Then a horn sounds and a number of Trollocs emerge, about 500 of them. Some men fire early until Tam yells at them and reminds them of their training. And then Tam suggests to Perrin that they fire at 300 paces. He's a little confused about why he is being asked, but he agrees. And At this point, the battle begins. I just wrote down arrows, explosions, catapults, then it's over. The village is victorious. Many of the people in town are congratulating him, even though he insists that he didn't do anything. And Perrin says the merge rail should have known that this was a futile attack, and why not send more? The warders compliment him on his instincts and recognizing that this was a futile attack in the first place, and they say that this was simply a test of the defenses of the two rivers, and that they probably could have brought a large number of Trollocs if they wanted to. Perrin worries that, say, 10,000 of them would create a significant issue for the town, but Varen says that because they are coming through the ways, they can only bring small groups at a time, and so it's unlikely that there are that many of them, even though there are likely a large number of Trollocs still in the two rivers. At this point, Fael threatens Perrin if he goes after Loyal, because it sure seems like he's going to, and then suddenly there are shouts from the other side of town, which causes Perrin to remark he is shocked that there was another Trolloc attack so soon when the warders were so confident it would be a long time, but we don't get any further details about the origin of those shouts. It's, I guess, kind of a little bit maybe a cliffhanger. What did you think of chapter 44, which for me is most notable for having a very brief action sequence, which is how all action sequences should be?
Yeah, my notes on it are good, quick battle.
Yeah.
Actually, and I'm gonna digress by saying I saw a funny thing on Twitter, which was somebody on it was actually on Threads because I'm not on Twitter, but
Yeah.
who cares? On the internet,
I mean,
somebody
Twitter
was
doesn't exist
complaining that they
anymore.
watched. Right. So they were watching the new Zack Snyder Rebel Dawn, which we took some pod shots at last episode, and they said, "This stupid movie is just the plot of A Bug's Life. Tell me I'm wrong." And somebody responded, "I am begging you to see movies before the year 2000, like begging you." And so I like that as a reminder here that we are in this kind of seven samurai kind
Yeah.
of structure. We're not quite exactly there because there hasn't been a strong like training montage essentially yet
Yeah.
where parents preparing the townspeople. But I agree that it was nice that we got this
Yeah.
and that it was nice both that we got it and that it was brief. And
Yeah.
I'm coming to appreciate this about Robert Jordan because I do have trouble following sword fights in books and so on. So it's
Yeah.
nice to just kind of skip to the what are the results of it. And then I know it's not the exact right scene from Jurassic Park, but I just when they talk about the Myrddraal testing the defenses, I just went clever girl because that just felt like what it is.
Yeah.
It's smart. They're seeing what they can do, and then they'll be back and in greater numbers.
Yeah, I can't disagree with any of that. That's exactly what I thought about this chapter. We need to start having different impressions of chapters more often because me agreeing with you is less fun. Um, the early section of this chapter then seems to be an extended argument between Fael and Perrin about whether or not he's well enough to get out of bed. And the answer is no. And then the answer they decide on is sure, you can get out of bed. I didn't really have a whole lot of investment in this section of the chapter, but I do think Robert Jordan is trying to say something interesting about like how do you convince someone to do something they don't want to do? Is it like, the vinegar or honey thing? But it's something I've heard so many times, I'm not super engaged by it. Was that your take as well?
No, you're wrong, and I hate everything you just said.
Now we're talking
That's
podcast.
the content you want. uh, no, so in reading that early section, I felt it was an extension of the conversation from last chapter, which is actually part of leadership is also sitting back sometimes,
Yeah.
and particularly this idea of Loyal and Gaul win out on the mission. It's like, yeah, a true leader wants to be there and put only themselves at risk and keep everybody else safe, but you have to delegate.
Yeah.
I mean, this is so lame. Now that I'm a department chair and my university, I want to all the time, when there's like 5 tasks to be done, I'm usually the first to be like, I'll take it, I'll do it my way, and it'll be done. And I almost ran myself into exhaustion. It's like, no, part of it is
Yeah.
making sure you fight the battles that you need to fight. And when there's a clear goal that somebody else can achieve, you let them go do it. My side hope as a reader of this book is that I hope we get some of that plot. I don't want them to just show back up two
Yeah.
chapters from now and be like, all set, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm bold enough to hope for a Loyal POV, but some time there would
That's
be
the
really fun.
dream. Yeah, I think the only other note that I had here, I think you're exactly right to think about this as a question of delegation or not. And then we also see the reverse of that in the next chapter, where Perrin is kind of angry that people are asking, or not in the next chapter, in the next section of this chapter, where Perrin is almost like frustrated that people are asking for his approval. And it's like, no, that's kind of what a leader is supposed to be doing most of the time. It's just verifying that what others are doing is right rather than doing it themselves. The other quick note that I had here is that I think Robert Jordan actually has a really great eye for physical comedy. Like the idea of Perrin being so sick that he falls down the stairs and it definitely looks like he's having sex with Perrin or that he's having sex with Fail in the stairwell is a hilarious thing for Mistress Elvire to walk in on. It just doesn't make sense on the page, right? Like this could be very funny if it shows up in the television show. I just don't think it will. I have nothing else to say there. That was just a fun little visual joke in a non-visual medium.
Well, Robert Jordan took our lead. Um, yeah, well, and I'll just extend it by saying I thought the kind of stubborn muley thing was kind of funny too. Like
Yeah.
it's this could be an episode of Mad About You or something that's like looking at
Yeah.
couples and the interrelationships, but we've returned to this theme over and over again about specifically how Two Rivers men act in relationship to those women.
Yep.
And while it's always a little different, we're always learning a little bit more. It kind of all goes back to the very opening of book 1 2 years ago when they are like, well, we let the men do this little council thing, but we
Yeah.
really decide things on our side. And I think all of that just works comedically, and
Yeah.
it is fun to see Fail kind of get the orientation to that.
Yeah, and then I think to me the most interesting moment at in this chapter is at the very end of this section when Fail does a complete 180, right? She learns from Mistress Elvire. You kind of like give them what they want, except for the one thing that you really need to stand up on. And then Fail very quickly is like, okay, you can go outside. And there's actually a really interesting standoff between Fail and Marin Alvire that I thought was really well done by Robert Jordan. I think it's only like 2 or 3 lines of text, but it really got me for a moment. I was like almost holding my breath. Like, are we gonna have a fight about who gets to tell Perrin what to do here? And the fact that the mayor's wife who runs the inn backed off, I think tells us a lot about how these people are viewing the relationship between Perrin and Fail, right? He might be a Two Rivers man, but he's also kind of hers at this point.
Yeah, and I mean, I was thinking a little bit of Egwene too, because I miss her, and it's been a long time since we saw Egwene.
And it's her mom.
But and it's her mom, right? And so thinking about how this is kind of the life Egwene had, or I don't want to say the life, the role she had with the boys is this kind of push pull, this kind of
Yeah.
way of dictating to them without dictating to them. And I think you're right to say that what we're seeing now is the boys have Perrin in this case has grown beyond that. Like
Yeah.
he is now leveled up to the point where he is now destined for seemingly the nobility in some sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And watching Perrin try to figure out how does he have so much power with the people in the Two Rivers despite not wanting it, and simultaneously, how does he have absolutely no power with Fail despite feeling like he should have a lot of authority in that relationship? I think that's kind of a fun interplay for that character to be at, right? He's simultaneously much more and less powerful than he would like to be. I think if he could be a lord in his relationship and a peasant in this community, he would prefer that to the flip flop that he currently has.
In that, I'm thinking of the last conversation again. That just means he's a good leader,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
Because he doesn't crave the power.
So at this point, then Perrin goes outside, and we have just like 18 examples of him thinking about how everyone is asking for his opinion, even though he doesn't have anything meaningful to say. This gets at something we've already discussed, but kind of interlaced with that is Perrin thinking about the motivations of the Aes Sedai, and he comes up with kind of an interesting theory that I don't know if it would have been my go-to, but it makes perfect sense, right? He seems to be of the opinion that the Aes Sedai, the reason that he is kind of perceived as this, like hero or as a lord, is because they are trying to set him up to be kind of the leader of this area, and they think that will benefit their plans. And this both kind of is really intuitive from Perrin in a way that I don't know I would have thought of him as being kind of politically minded and sniffing out these kind of schemes. But I think it's also just notable because it really does kind of highlight how Perrin is assuming that he can't be the leader on his own. It must be someone else's scheme that is creating this. And that is a really, I think it's slightly different from what we were describing before, right? Him not liking being a leader and him thinking that he is not capable of being a leader are both issues he's dealing with. But this almost feels more imposter syndrome-y than some of the other stuff we were discussing before.
Yes, I think that's right. To note that it is imposter syndrome and it's his way, it's not conscious reluctance like we were just talking about. It's
Yeah.
actually that more unconscious side of imposter syndrome and not thinking he's the right person or up to the task in those regards. And I just don't lose sight of the fact that he just kind of had right last week
Yeah.
slash 4 days ago for us, that he did have this real blow where he did exactly what he thought was right and made essentially a dunderheaded mistake that has now let the dark forces continue to have an advantage here. So I think
Yeah.
that feels like it's still resonant in his mind, even if it feels far off for us.
No, absolutely. Um, my next note that I had is something that I will observe about Robert Jordan that I think is also true of a few other fantasy authors that I'm familiar with, which is that my impression is that every person who I've ever read who writes about battles who has never been in a battle, they focus on the action. But the people who write about battles who have actually gone to war, like Robert Jordan, they spend almost as much time writing about the waiting as they do about the battle itself. And I feel like that is
Mhm.
probably accurate of what military conflict must be, right? If you think about like the Civil War or the Vietnam War, there are like a dozen battles that we can name, but they lasted years. And so this
Mhm.
kind of
Yeah, that's a good
idea
point.
of war being boring to some degree, I found really interesting. And I thought it was really well portrayed here, where Perrin almost kind of has a chance to do a lap of all of his thoughts before the Trollocs actually arrive.
Yes, I like that point a lot. I had not thought of that. I like that general interpretation. And it just feels of a piece with those that, again, thinking there's great glory in war,
Yeah.
but if you've actually been in war, it's mundane and it's awful when it is exciting, right? Like
Yeah.
it's a kind of awful excitement. It's reminding me a little of Dune, where
Yeah.
Frank Herbert's intention was to make this character Paul Atreides that everybody would be repulsed by, but the kind of ways in which he schemed and conquered, like people loved, and so he had to come back and write the next book to be like, no, no, he's terrible,
Yeah.
terrible. That you guys missed the point, and I think that has to do with his own version. I mean, it's a more complicated picture with Herbert, but
Yeah.
I do think it's a similar impulse to say no. There's not actual glory here, as our dear Yoda would say. Wars not make one great.
That's not where I would have gone at all. But yes, that is what he would say. Uh, we've already talked about how wonderful it was that this battle only took about a quarter of a page. It was perfect. And then we get this really interesting note. Perrin has a really good mind for military strategy, despite the fact that he's really maybe only participated in a single actual battle over the course of these like 3.5 books at this point. Um, I don't have a lot of notes on that, but both Tomas and Ivan seem very impressed by his interpretation of what's going on. They seem to kind of second him when he's talking about the size of the force that it would take to conquer the two rivers and how much damage could have been done. And even Perrin seems to acknowledge that his kind of read on the situation is correct, except for his misreading of how many Trollocs could have come through the way gates. So I think I did this maybe like 2 or 3 books ago. I was like, oh my God, Rand is really good at political machinations, and I wouldn't have expected that. I'm now kind of doing the same thing with Perrin, but it feels more stark because Perrin explicitly tells us multiple times in his narration that he is bad at political machinations.
Yes, and it made me feel like it's another old blood thing. That's where my mind went, right? Again, it comes back to book one. They're running down a hill, leading a charge for the first time in their lives, and they suddenly shout in the old tongue. There's something within these boys that's pushing its way to the surface,
Yeah.
much like what were those things called? Bubbles of evil or whatever?
Yeah. You got it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was like, that's too stupid. That's not it. And it wasn't. So it does feel like it's something like that, except darkness rises and light to meet it, to tell it to you like it's Star Wars again.
Yeah.
Which is that there's something good bubbling its way up here. And as we see these Tavir and take on larger and larger roles, I think they're tapping into something. That further makes me think about Matt, because Matt, it seemed like something external took him over. And I'm wondering if we, need to consider that as a third leg of this tripod, or if that is something different as I had previously contended.
I am going to give you absolutely no answers on that, but I will note that if we're talking about the old blood and how it sings in Matt or Perrin or Rand, it might also be worth noting the fact that it could be singing in a lot of other people in this area, right? The Two Rivers is apparently known in previous books for having really kind of exceptional archers, and the Two Rivers longbow being kind of a unique weapon that is really only used in this area. And it's worth noting a small town fighting off 500 Trollocs is not a thing that would happen in most parts of the world. And so part of this is obviously like the Seven Samurai training story that we're getting, but these people haven't gotten that much training. There may be something going on here with the old blood of Manetheren or Manethrin, depending on how we want to pronounce it, really kind of like giving the Two Rivers folks in general some sort of advantage or ability with these weapons. There may be some sort of kind of bloodline almost that makes them especially adept at defending this village.
Yeah, I like that. And then as we're thinking about this rise of so many powers, is this then a very powerful army uniting literally under a banner at the moment, and
Yeah.
to be another player in the larger game of games going on this continent?
Yeah, I think that is both exactly the right question and one that I can no longer say anything about. That's my job on this podcast. Any last thoughts on the Breaking Storm? Because this is a big old chapter, but as we've said with a lot of action oriented chapters in the past, sometimes we spend most of our time saying, yeah, that was good action, instead of having big character moments to analyze. Any last notes here?
No, you hit my whole list. I will say it was very enjoyable, and I find myself starting to understand how Perrin could be your favorite character. I mean, he's always been
Yeah.
interesting, but he's starting to take on this really cool role, and that's exciting. So, you just busted me looking at my book. I was cheating to see we do continue on with Perrin in the next chapter, but and I couldn't actually tell if the second chapter next week. Are we still with them, or is
It is
something
not. We
fresh?
are going to be splitting our POVs next week. It is worth noting
Nice.
when we are doing so, this is a big boy week next week. Both of the chapters are are actually just barely shorter than chapter 44 that we just read. And so the combination of the two is going to be one of our longer weeks, but it makes sense in terms of where we're at in the book to just get it done. We've got 9 weeks left. I refuse to extend that to 10. So next week, we'll be covering 2 chapters. That's chapter 45, The Tinker's Sword, and chapter 46, Veils. What are you hoping for, expecting, or looking forward to? Because we haven't talked about roller coasters in like a book, but the roller coaster is moving pretty fast right now, Greg. What are you anticipating as we reach the end of book 4?
Yeah, looking at my mass market paperback edition with the boring cover, as you made fun of me the other day, it's exactly 40 pages, so it is a big chunk, and that 40 pages puts us, pretty close to that final 200 pages mark, which is I tend to expect that to be the kind of climax. I do love how fantasy books, especially as they go on in a series, the climax tends to expand and expand and
Yeah.
expand because they have so many plot lines in a given book to start to wrap up. I'm excited to go somewhere else. I've very much enjoyed our time here in the Two Rivers, but I would like to get back to some of those other plot lines. Because this one feels so clearly headed towards a climax that I'm sure not predict accurately, but kind of anticipate. I'm very curious to see, are the others moving that quickly? Are those kind of longer plots that might stretch into the next book? So I will just say, because I already told Tyler this in a text message, I bought the next book. I warned last week that it was time to start looking, and then I found myself in a bookstore, and there it was. So, again, it's a good time of year to be outside reading. We hope you're enjoying these shows. We hope you go purchase some merch because that's very exciting. If you have merch and you take a picture of yourself with it eventually, make sure you tag us so we know it exists out there in the world. If you see Tyler on the street, he will autograph anything with our logo on it, even if it's a tattoo. So whatever you see. Also, I don't think we've ever revealed Tyler's face, so that's going to be a real
I,
tough challenge.
I was gonna say, if you recognize me on the street, I will sign literally anything you have. It doesn't have to be through the glass column themed, because who the hell would recognize me on the street?
All right. Note to self, get Tyler's face all over our social media. All right, everyone. We hope everything is good with you, and we look forward to you joining us next time through the glass columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tyler Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the glass columns.